Early in the summer, there was a story that came out about a sea otter on the West Coast that was interacting with surfers in a very interesting way. The sea otter was biting surfboards and getting on the surfboard and continuing to bite the surfboard. It made national headlines, international headlines. People wanted to know why this sea otter was doing things like this, why it was being so quote unquote aggressive towards the surfboards. Nobody was harmed in the incident, but it definitely made news and definitely put a sort of a curious focus on sea otters. Even for me, I was very interested. I don't know a lot about sea otters and sea otter conservation other than sort of the major talking points that we've seen before. But I thought it was a great opportunity to take the time to speak to sea otter experts on what sea otter population is like on the west coast of North America, especially in the Monterey Bay area. And so where this sea otter 841 that was found biting surfboards was living and being looked after by the program. And so what I wanted to do is invite Jess Fuji on, who is the Sea Otter Program Manager and Principal Investigator at the Monterey Bay Aquarium, to discuss the program, not just this one sea otter. We touch a little bit on it at the end, but to talk about just sort of where sea otter conservation is at in today and what we need to learn about sea otters and know about sea otters to better protect them. So that's on this episode of the How to Protect the Ocean podcast. Let's start the show. Hey everybody, welcome back to another exciting episode of the How to Protect the Ocean podcast, the podcast where you find out what's happening with the ocean, how you can speak up for the ocean, and what you can do to live for a better ocean by taking action. And on today's episode, we're going to be talking about sea otters, because there was a big story that came out earlier in the summer, as I mentioned in the pre-intro, where sea otter was found biting surfboards in the wild. And so, obviously a lot of people are very curious about sea otters after that. Are they all aggressive? Is it just that one? What can we do to better protect sea otters? What can we know about sea otters? And what do we need to know about them in the future? Because they've had quite the interesting past in terms of population and how their population is doing now, especially with the consequences of climate change really affecting everything. And so I asked a bunch of those questions, and Jess was very, very kind to be able to provide the answers for that. So I want you to enjoy this interview with Jess Fuji, the program manager and principal investigator at the Monterey Bay Aquarium. Enjoy, and I will talk to you after. Hey, Jess, welcome to the How to Protect the Ocean podcast. Are you ready to talk about sea otters at the Monterey Bay Aquarium?
I'm ready. Thanks so much for having me.
You bet. I am super excited for this because, as many of my audience members know, it was a huge story over the summer in 2023 about a sea otter that had, let's just say, a liking for surfboards in the sea, and it got a lot of news. It generated a lot of news, and although I don't want to focus necessarily on that story for this interview, what I wanted to do was talk more about sort of the sea otters on the West Coast and sea otters in general, and the program at the Monterey Bay Aquarium about sea otters. So that's sort of what I wanted to focus on. And so we're going to get into this whole program because it's quite an interesting program. So I wanted to kind of talk about that and see what we can get out of that. But first, I want to kind of get to know you and see where you're coming from and where you came from and how you ended up at Monterey Bay and working with sea otters. So if you can just let us know who you are and what you do.
My name is Jess Fuji. My pronouns are she, her, and I am the Sea Otter Program Manager and Principal Investigator at the Monterey Bay Aquarium. I've been with the aquarium for 15 years, and as part of that work, I've been involved with sea otter research on the wild population that we have in California, as well as overseeing our rescue and rehabilitation program, where we take otters that have been stranded or orphaned and found along the coast, provide care, and then eventually release them back to the wild whenever possible.
That's I feel like obviously it can be very stressful and intense on the rehabbing and rescuing of sea otters, but to be able to work with sea otters, I would feel, as someone who's also a marine biologist who loves to work with animals, you're a bit living the dream a little bit, aren't you? Like, as a marine biologist working with such a charismatic animal, was that always the dream was to work with sea otters or something like a mammal like that?
Yeah, so like, many children, I had this idea of being a marine biologist from a very young age before I even knew what that meant. Um,
Yeah.
and I was very fortunate that I actually grew up with my family taking me to the Monterey Bay Aquarium. So I got to learn
Hmm.
about our ocean right in our backyard, as well as sea otters and all the other really incredible species that we have around here. As I was growing and learning about other things, I didn't want to be, someone who was studying sea otters. I was going to study something that no one else cared about, but was really important. And there's tons of that.
Yeah.
And then while I was in my undergraduate studies, I actually started volunteering with the Monterey Bay Aquarium with our sea otter program, with the research team, and just learning, how important sea otters are to their ecosystem, all the amazing behaviors, how they've adapted to living in the marine environment. That really hooked me and kept me, and so I've been with them ever
Yeah.
since.
Sure, there are a lot of people who want to work with the Monterey Bay Aquarium. And so, how does one sort of like initiate that? Was it just the continuation of working with them over the years that got you those relationships? And if somebody wanted to work with the Monterey Bay Aquarium, what would you recommend?
So there's really no one way. If they wanted to be involved in, research or an aquarium, there's so many different venues to or avenues to go about that. Mine in particular was by volunteering with the research team, going on for graduate school to continue my studies and get that experience. But we also have people who are taking care of the animals every day. We have people who are focused on the science communication, um, or developing art that goes along with communicating with our visitors
Mm.
about all of our goals. So all of those roles are incredibly important and play a big role in our collective goal of inspiring conservation of the ocean.
So, how big is the team for Monterey Bay, like that research part, or actually, sorry, for the Sea Otter program in general?
For the Sea Otter program, there's 9 of us. So we're
9
not
of you.
huge, and specifically for our the team that focuses on providing the care of those otters, that are brought to us for rehabilitation. They're potentially having to cover 7 days a week, 20 hours a
Yeah.
day, and then we also have a lot of volunteers that help support that because it is such a big lift. And then, of course, there's other
Hmm.
departments at the aquarium that are providing other vital support.
Yeah, I think a lot of people don't realize how much goes on with a rescue and a rehabilitation. Some of these animals require that 7 days, 24-hour kind of care, and for volunteers to do that, for the people that part of your staff to do that, and other departments to be able to chip in where that's possible. That's a lot of stress that goes in, plus the emotional and mental stress of taking care of an animal that's obviously in trouble because that's why they were stranded. In terms of strandings with sea otters, you don't like I'm from Ontario in Canada. So we get some information from the West Coast. A lot of it is higher level kind of information, marine protected areas, and we see obviously the great white sharks are always a huge draw in terms of media coverage and so forth. And we don't really hear a lot. I mean, we hear a lot about other marine mammal strandings, dolphins and orcas and things like that, especially from the West Coast. We don't always hear a lot about sea otter strandings in sort of the major news. Can you kind of give me a sense of how often sea otters get
Yeah,
stranded?
so how frequent they strand, or where they strand, or why they strand can really vary year to year.
Mm.
So we are responding, to anywhere between 30 and 80 sea otters. and many more might be, calls that end up not requiring an actual response. But um,
Hmm.
and those are within anywhere within the current southern sea otter range, which is in the central portion of California. And so we also work with other partners who might be able to respond, faster than us. They're closer, so we have a lot of external collaborations as well that really help us,
Right.
respond. And often these calls that we're receiving are from the general public. There's people, hanging out on the beach, and they hear a pup crying or they see a sea otter on land and they're not expecting that. So we will get that call. And the cause of stranding can really vary from injury, disease, and the one we're most known for responding and providing care to are pups, sea otter pups that have for some
Mm.
reason been separated from their mother, and when they're that young, they're really dependent on their mother. They're not going to survive on their own. So those animals, even though otherwise
Right.
they might be relatively healthy, they really do need a
Hmm.
high level of care in order to survive and grow before they're ready to be on their own.
And how long does it take them? Like, so I should ask. So when you bring in a pup, it's obviously small, and like you said, you have to kind of take care of it. It won't be able to take care of itself in the wild. How long would, and I'm sure it varies as well by individual, but on like sort of on average, or can you give us a sense of how long a pup would stay in the care of the Monterey Bay Aquarium before it's deemed appropriate to
Mm.
release at work and survive on
Yeah,
its
so
own?
with the pups, they actually go through this program that we refer to as our surrogacy program. So we pair these orphan pups with one of our resident adult female sea otters that live at the aquarium.
Okay.
And so they actually help take on that role of bonding with this pup and acting as its mother. So, acting as
Oh.
a surrogate mother. Um, and so they are together for 4 months. And during that time, the
Hmm.
mom is, helping to groom the pup, kind of teach it how to dive down and eat, live prey or, find its food and groom itself as well as it
Hmm.
gets older. Um, and then so that gets the pup to about 6 months of age, which is when we typically see pups
Hmm.
weaned from their mother or go off on their own from the mother in the wild. And then there will still
Right.
be additional work that we're doing after that stage. So they're being socialized with other sea otters that are receiving care. They're continuing to practice how to find and process live prey. Um, and then and that
Hmm.
is part of the preparation for being able to release them back to the wild. So the whole process can sometimes take a year to a year and a half. And some of the pups we get,
Wow.
they're only a day old, if that, when they come in. So there's also, you know, time before they're paired with that mother, that surrogate mother, that we are having to
Yeah.
provide hands on care to get that pup healthy enough for that next stage.
That's interesting. I thought it would take a lot longer, like not the year and a half. That's interesting how quickly they can start to learn on their own. Does it take a long time for the surrogate mother to bond with the pup?
So our resident female sea otters are absolutely amazing. You know,
I
uh,
can imagine.
Rosa, one of our oldest otter, or our oldest sea otter, um, she surrogate reared 15 sea otters pups in her time with
Wow.
us before she got to enjoy retirement and just gets to enjoy
Yeah.
being at the aquarium. And
Right.
so for some of our, female otters that we have, they're very quick to accept a pup as their own, and we will see them, grooming the pup, sharing food with the pup. Sometimes within the first hour that they've been placed together. Other times it does take more slow introductions. And so our staff are very closely monitoring when these two otters are, first introduced to each other, to make sure no one is getting stressed out, and that is all going well. And then, may decide to separate the two animals and then try again the next day. And so usually it can be anywhere between, hours or a day, to, maybe a week that it might take.
That's crazy. That's pretty cool to even think about. It was Rosa, I believe, like, to bond with 15 pups and help her 15 pups. I feel like she deserves an award. I guess she's got retirement, which is nice too, but that's a lot of
Mhm.
work for her. It's insane to think about how natural it is for them to sort of take that role over and bond with, a strange, basically pup, a strange baby. I think that's pretty phenomenal that these animals can do that. Um, Getting back to the program, the Monterey Bay Aquarium program, we kind of know, and I've covered sea otters on this podcast from sort of a high level in terms of populations have fluctuated over the last number of centuries, since the 1700s, where they're 150,000 to 300,000, and then the fur trade comes in, and then it dips down, and at one point there were like 50 50 around, and then it kind of grew back, and then a lot of the legislation that has been passed since the 1970s have kind of helped, especially the Marine Mammal Protection Act, have kind of helped these sea otters kind of rebound a little bit. um, just to kind of give people a perspective, what are sea otter numbers at right now?
Yeah, so our last, official census, that is led by the U.S. Geological Survey and the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service, was unfortunately back in 2019. Um, with COVID and other factors, there have been limitations to our ability to do that full census. So from that report, we were just shy of three as a what we refer to as the 3-year average, and that number is often used to help adjust for annual fluctuations in our count. So that 3-year average was just a little under 3,000 sea otters, in all of California. So that is still, based on recovery criteria, still considered threatened on the endangered species list.
But definitely a long way from 50
Yes.
back in the early
Hmm.
19th century or early 20th century, to see that. So that's quite a success story. Um, since the major hunt pressure, what have been the biggest challenges? I mean, obviously not since, maybe even not even that far back, but like today, what are the major challenges that these animals face, to that will prevent them from recouping or even growing further?
Yeah, so sea otters in California are still a long ways off from being considered recovered. So there's still a
Mm,
significant portion of habitat where we know they used to be that there are still no sea otters present. So they're also not
mm,
contributing their ecosystem function in those areas because they're absent. So there has been a lot of research and monitoring over decades, to understand what is limiting that recovery, what is needed, moving forward to help support that recovery. Um, and kind of the two biggest things that stand out, are that in the last 15 to 20 years, we've been seeing an increase in otter mortality related to being bit by
mm.
sharks, most likely white sharks.
Okay.
And so that is something that there is still research ongoing to understand, why is this changing? Is it, more sharks, where the sharks are present, changes in the otter behavior, or things like that. But regardless, the fact is, majority of the otter mortalities, that we recover and record with all of our partners are related to shark bites, and that is impeding growth.
It's a big shark bite too, I can imagine, for some of these guys, and some of these animals. it's interesting because we talk. I have another podcast where I do Beyond Jaws, where we talk about a lot of sharks, and we don't just talk about great whites, hence the name, but one of the big conservation success stories in the U.S. and on their and its coastal waters is the fact that we've seen an increase in population on both coasts, or the East Coast and the West Coast, in great white sharks, and a lot of that has to do with a lot of the protections and so forth. Um, Before, like I guess when great white shark populations were lower, was there anything else like, I guess maybe we should just talk about other things that affect them. I mean, that's obviously a big thing that you're all observing and you're researching. What other things that are affecting them?
Yeah, so the other big thing, is we haven't seen, the population expand their range, back into their historical habitat, in about 20 years. Um, and so within where we're currently seeing sea otters, they've been there, since the 1930s or 80s, as the population has grown since that population in Big Sur. And so many of those areas are at what we would consider, resource limitation or carrying capacity. That can
Mhm.
fluctuate a little bit with different environmental conditions, but for the most part, the areas where there are sea otters right now are supporting about as many sea otters as it can. Um, so
Right.
in terms of continued growth, we would really need to see the population expand its range to be able to support more sea otters. Um, and then we continue just have you know a wide variety of you know stranding and mortality related to different diseases. So things like harmful algal blooms, which impact other marine mammals, can also impact sea otters.
Hmm.
Um, and there's other, because sea otters live and forage so close to shore. Diseases
Hmm.
that are maybe terrestrial, focused, end up washing and end up, in the sea otter's environment. So they can be impacted by parasites and diseases in that way as well.
You mentioned a lot about the range not being able or not expanding. Uh, is it due to the habitat quality of their former range just not being up to par as it used to be, and or similar or a healthy kind of thing compared to like the main range right now?
Yeah, that's a great question, and one we are trying to better understand. Based on everything that has been explored so far, it is actually looking like white sharks might be part of this as well, because where the ranges are ending are kind of these kind of main hubs of where white sharks will often be foraging on their primary mammal prey of different seals and sea lions. Um, and none of this is, to paint the white sharks in a bad light. They're just trying to survive. They're a
Of
part of the
course.
healthy
Yeah.
ecosystem just as much. But
Right.
because there was that limitation from the hunting, if sea otters had already been north or south of these areas, it may not have been as much of an issue. But because they are recovering from that, small location, small population in Big Sur, right now it appears that um, their range ends are kind of almost hitting this physical boundary of high predation, or not really predation, because the sharks are not
Hmm.
eating the sea otters. They're not a good source of food, but that risk of
Ah.
mortality does seem to be impeding their ability to move beyond that.
Yeah, so it just seems to be where that boundary is. Okay. Here's a question, and I'm not familiar with the process of trying to grow a population, especially a marine mammal population. When we look at people trying to grow fish populations, sometimes some fish are stocked certain areas, and they release them into certain areas. Is it similar when you talk about something like a sea otter program where you can have these, maybe some of these individuals that you take on that are hurt or that are like some of the pups that are abandoned, and then you have them reared and so forth, and then all of a sudden they're ready to be released. Would you release them into a different area to try and populate that area, or is that just bad form or bad ethics when it comes to marine mammals, maybe putting them where they're already seen and there's already a sea otters in there, knowing that they have a better chance of survival?
Yeah, so right now, all the sea otters that go through our rehabilitation program are released within their current range. And with our pups that had been surrogate reared for the first 15 years when we were developing our surrogacy program, we focused those releases in one estuary within
Hmm.
their range, known as Elkhorn Slough. And
Okay.
in doing that and in our monitoring of the animals, even after release, we were able to see that the population within that estuary grew from about 20 sea otters to over 100. Um, and
Wow.
so that was not just the animals we released, but also that they stayed there, that they survived, and that they were reproducing. Um, so
That's amazing.
we are finding that rearing these pups and releasing them can impact in a positive way, the population, as well as the ecosystem benefits. Even though that was not our intention when we started releasing the otters there, other researchers did find that there were ecosystem benefits by having that sea otter population in the estuary. Um, so yeah, to get to your question moving forward, there is this idea of could we use, these pups that wouldn't have survived otherwise, except for receiving the care that they do at the Monterey Bay Aquarium, to release them outside of the range to try and seed um, you know a, another portion of the population. Um, there's a
Hmm.
lot that goes into that. So that is not a formal proposal. There's a lot of
Hmm.
considerations, about how other impacts, both positive and potential negative, for different fisheries and other people who have lived in those areas and have not seen a sea otter up there in over 100 years. Um, so that all needs to be taken into consideration as well.
So it must be must make you feel pretty good, the people who work at the Monterey Bay Aquarium, to see such a boom, like going from 20 to 100 in that estuary. That's got to be, when working in conservation, things take time. Sometimes, you don't see things change for 20, 30, 40, maybe even 50 years, maybe as people retire or they don't get to see that benefit right off the bat. To be able to see that benefit in such a small amount of time, that must make you feel pretty good in terms of like, hey, we hit a big conservation success here.
Yeah, our work is definitely not done, but through our research, through our
Hmm.
rehab program, through our ongoing monitoring and partnerships, I think we have already been able to show that we can have a positive impact and that we can continue to do so.
That's fantastic. You mentioned research, and obviously there's a lot of research that goes into this. When we talk about a species that needs to be recovered, it's in part of the Endangered Species Act, as you mentioned. It's still considered threatened. There's a lot of research that goes in. Can you give us, a sense of what type of research programs you're running? I'm sure there's multiple projects that are going on. Can you talk about a few of those and just give us a bit of a description of those?
Yeah, so a lot of our research is, understanding the threats that sea otters are facing. So, every animal that comes in, working with our veterinary team, we're trying to understand why did the animal strand, and that can
Mm,
help inform, any trends. So whether that's sharks or emerging new diseases or things that are maybe becoming more frequent because of climate change, having all of that data, that long-term monitoring is really key,
mhm.
to be able to understand what is currently happening and what we might see moving forward into the future. And then also a lot of research related to the role sea otters play in their ecosystems. Um, there's been a lot of research done on this, but there's still so much more to learn. And as we're seeing changes to their habitat from marine heat waves or other large ecosystem changes, what are the impacts of that, and what role might sea otters play in maintaining the health of the ecosystems they live in? We want to better understand that.
Right. And speaking of which, this has been a huge year in terms of temperature, and just changes in the climate in general. Um, it's an El Nino year. I believe it's like the first year of this El Nino sort of event. But there have been other El Nino events, specifically in the early, I believe it was early 2010s. Were you at Monterey Bay at that point? I believe so, right? In the last El Nino session?
Yeah, so probably the
Okay.
last big one that we're still seeing impacts from is the 2013, 2014, which was part of like the
Right.
marine blob, all of that.
Yes.
Mhm.
And you already mentioned that they're still seeing
Mhm.
impacts from that. What type of impacts do you see from that massive heat wave that we saw in the ocean?
Yeah, so from that marine heat wave, we had dramatic declines in kelp, um, and that was
Mm-hmm.
seen, all throughout California. But that was even more the case in Northern California, so north of where we currently have sea otters. Um, Around that same time period, we had massive loss of sea stars all along, the west coast of North America, um,
Mm-hmm.
and and so the cascading impacts of that are also still being understood. Particularly the sunflower sea star is a big one of interest, um, and so in our neck of the woods and in our small backyard, we were really looking at sea otters were here, and the big prey item of interest related to kelp and sea stars are urchins, sea urchins.
Mm-hmm.
And so seeing how those changed, and how sea otters responded to eating, more or specific urchins in their diet, and how that impacted um, areas that we saw kelp was able to remain in those areas. And we didn't see the
Mm.
same loss that we saw in some of the other areas.
So the sea otters actually provide a benefit in that time where, if there's not enough predation on sea urchins from the sea stars, you see it from the sea otters. Would that be a correct statement?
Yeah, so we, based on research, from several decades ago now, focused in Alaska. This is where sea otters really became known as keystone species. And
Mm-hmm.
that was showing as sea otters returned to an area, they focused on eating urchins. And by relieving that grazing pressure on the kelp was able to recover. And then we saw, the cascading benefits of that with increased biodiversity, other, marine species that rely on kelp forests. Um, but that was really requiring on sea otters going from absence to presence, and in high
Mm-hmm.
numbers. So understanding how those dynamics might be a little bit different when we have these big ecological changes in an area where sea otters have been present, what was part of that research. And so, yes, continuing to find the role they play by eating these urchins and changing not only their abundance but also the
Mm-hmm.
urchin behavior, which is something that hadn't been looked at as much prior.
That's really interesting. So this is the type of research that your team does to be able to sort of look at these fluctuations and see how how these impacts continue to happen. Now, walking into, well, not walking into, but seeing a new El Nino event happen, are there certain, knowing that this is going to be a beginning of maybe 2, maybe 3 year event, are there certain things that your team's going to focus on for research to kind of I guess not take advantage of the event, but to kind of monitor as you go through, and questions that you want to answer that you may not have been able to answer last time, that kind of came up through observations of some of the consequences or benefits in that respect?
Yeah, I mean, so really all of this really relies and depends on, large collaborations with other researchers as well. There's just too much to try and keep track of.
Yeah.
So, there's a lot of other amazing groups as well that are doing long-term monitoring and they might focus on a specific species, or they might have specific
Hmm.
areas that they've been following over time. So really making sure that they're able to keep doing their work as well. Um, and then, yes, for us continuing to, monitor the population, and help set up, additional monitoring for
Hmm.
maybe some of those ecosystem changes that we saw previously.
Now, along with the rehabbing and rescuing, and then the research aspect, there's Monterey Bay Aquarium's known for the communication. You guys have great a communications team. I believe also your researchers and stuff share a lot of information with the public and so forth. Obviously, this past summer with the event with the sea otter that was interacting with some surfers, that made it a big deal in news. And for me as someone who sees it as a science communicator, I look at that and I say this could be a potential danger to these animals in the future if people see them as, quote unquote aggressive, or could potentially harm, not that they were harming any human beings in the water, but potentially being aggressive towards there and somebody getting hurt. From the Monterey Bay Aquarium's perspective, how is that handled in terms of saying, hey, look, these animals, obviously this was an interaction. What's the process in that respect of from a communication standpoint, and even like with your research background, to educate the public on sea otters and potential interactions and dangers and so forth?
Yeah, I mean, I'm definitely not going to take any credit whatsoever for our aquarium's wonderful communications team. They do an amazing job. But yeah, so for me, I was really working closely with them to keep them updated on what was being observed, what was being reported in this particular case, and make sure everyone was able to keep the facts straight, because
Hmm.
there's so many. Nuances that go along with these sorts of interactions, that we want as much as possible to try and make sure the correct information is going out. Um,
Hmm.
and in the case with this particular otter, the response that we were seeing from the public was less the worry about, the fear of this aggressive
Hmm.
animal. It was more, oh, sea otters are cute and furry. They're not a danger. And
Right.
so we actually started seeing an increase in people trying to get too close to sea otters, approaching the
Ah,
sea otters, whether or not it was the one in question.
right.
And so working with our agency and other NGO partners to get the messaging out about why it's so important to keep your distance from wildlife, and in particular sea
Hmm.
otters, both for their own safety, because there is
Yeah.
the potential for bites that could be,
Hmm.
truly harmful, but also for the health of the otter. It is not good for them if they are getting used to approaching people, and maybe even associating that with a positive thing.
So is there a lot of, I guess, a lot of education through the aquarium as well on, the do's and don'ts of when you come across a sea otter, or any other animal, a sea lion or anything like that. We've seen some, there are videos of some pretty bad interactions with people more south of you guys, but with sea lions and so forth. And so I guess that's where a lot of the education happens, of educating the public, the people who come to the Monterey Bay Aquarium, as well as your communications team outside of the aquarium, to say these are still wild animals. We want to protect both you and them. It's best to observe and from a
Mhm.
distance, I assume. And are there regulations in terms of distances? I know for for boating and for with orcas and things like that on Canada's side as well as on the US side, you can only come within a certain number of meters. I think it's a 200 or 400 meters, depending on where you are and what kind of outfit you are, if you're whale watchers or just a recreational boat. Are there certain distances, like minimal distances, that you have to stay with from a sea otter, because it's obviously endangered and it's illegal to disrupt them, as well as the Marine Mammal Protection Act, it's illegal to disrupt them?
The sea otters are protected under the Marine Mammal Protection Act as well as the Endangered Species Act. And the Marine Mammal Protection Act doesn't necessarily give specific distances as a regulation, but it does
Hmm.
specify that if you are altering that marine mammal's behavior, that can be
Right.
considered a harassment. Um,
Gotcha.
and so the general guidelines to prevent that are, if you're on a kayak, to stay at least 60 feet away, which is
Hmm.
about 5 kayak lengths. Recognizing that it can be sometimes difficult to estimate distance when you're on the water. But also, just being aware of your surroundings if you are, approaching wildlife. And if depending on the location that people are on the water, being able to pass parallel to the animals rather than, aiming your kayak directly towards them. Um,
Right.
and so, I mean, the biggest takeaway is just be aware of the wildlife around you and keep your distance. And if you see
Yeah.
them, starting to react, you're too close and you need to back away immediately.
And now, if somebody sees an animal like a sea otter in
Mhm.
distress, maybe it's injured or it seems distressed, it's on the shore, it can't move. What would you recommend that they do?
Yeah, so the best thing that people can do if they come across a sea otter that they think is in any level of distress is to observe it from a distance, keep
Hmm.
others and their pets, away from the animal, and to report it to the appropriate agencies as quickly as they possibly can, to relay that
Hmm.
information. Um, and who that agency might be might depend on the location or the particular species
Hmm.
that the person is observing.
Now, a question that I had a couple of people reach out to me as I was preparing for this interview. The individual animal that was sort of the subject of the news that was interacting with the surfers. Can you give? Do you have an update? Is the animal doing well? Has it been? Have there been any other incidences, or was it relocated to a safer area where there'd be less interaction?
Yeah, so as of right now, she is still in the wild. She is still in the same general area. We've worked with our partners to continue monitoring her, um, and
Hmm.
assess, if and when capture is feasible and necessary. So there's a wide number of considerations that go in whether to move forward with that. And so at this point,
Gotcha.
we're focused at the monitoring stage and assessing.
Okay. Well, that's good to hear. Good to hear they're doing well, and it's important to get that. Jess, I want to thank you so much for taking the time out of your busy day to be able to join us today and let us know how things are run at the Monterey Bay Aquarium for the Sea Otter program. Obviously, I'm sure a lot of the people in my audience are like very envious of the work that you and your team get to do, although it's hard work. You spent a lot of time with the sea otters and so forth. So I think it's just great that you're able to do that. So we really appreciate you dedicating time not only in the work that you do, but also spending time with us today and letting us know about the sea otter program. We'd love to invite you back on some of the new research that you guys been able to do in the next upcoming year and so forth, to give us updates on how the sea otters are doing.
Yeah, it was wonderful chatting with you. So thank you.
You bet. No problem. Thank you so much. Thank you, Jess, for joining us on the How to Protect the Ocean podcast. It was great to have you on to find out more about the Monterey Bay Aquarium program, the Sea Otter program, and to find out all the latest research that has happened with the program, and to find out more about what we can do when we see an injured sea otter. Very interesting to hear that sea otter, one of the major risks for sea otters are sharks right now in the Monterey Bay area, as well as other areas, as well as, and that's affecting their ability to populate habitats where they've been before. So obviously, it really sheds a light and really highlights a point where if a population decreases for whatever, in this case, hunting, back in the 1800s when the sea otter pelts were used quite a bit for warmth and for clothing, the recovery of that, with everything else taken out and everything else controlled, could happen pretty quickly once you protect them from the fur trade. But when there are other variables at hand, like climate change or like movements of population, which could be related to climate change, that could impede the growth of the population to the levels that were there before. It's very difficult to control that growth or to allow that growth to happen when other variables that are probably more considered natural, like predation, is affecting the population size. That's why it's so difficult. That's why scientists are so cautious in doing anything that will change the population side, an important population side of a predator or an apex predator, to say, we need to make sure that this population stays the same, because if we get rid of this population or we lower that population, it may not come back the way it once was, and that could affect a lot of the systems. Sea otter populations definitely can affect kelp populations, in terms of sea urchin control, which predates on kelp, and kelp beds are very, very important for that West Coast system. And it's just it's just a very fragile system, and when you mess with the system, when humans mess with the system, there are consequences, and we're seeing those consequences every day, and so especially this summer. And so now, to be able to have a program like the one at the sea otter program at Monterey Bay Aquarium is extremely important, to be able to monitor this population growth and to make sure that there's still a good population size there, and to make sure that the population size is healthy. So lots of information in there. I hope you definitely enjoyed it. If you have any questions or comments, I'd be happy to take them. But first, go to the links. I'll link to the marine biology or the sea otter program at the Monterey Bay Aquarium, as well as, there are other links online that I'll try and link to about the story and about what other things that we'll talk about, and probably my other episode on sea otters that we talked about, where 841 was the topic of conversation. But I want to thanks again to Jess for joining us on the program. It's great to be able to take that time out of her busy schedule and be able to talk to me about this and share her story, as well as the Sea Otter program story with us on, with How to Protect the Ocean. And so I think that's really, really important. So thank you so much, Jess, for that. And of course, if you have any questions or comments for me, or that I can relate to Jess, please contact me on Instagram. DM me at How to Protect the Ocean. That's at How to Protect the Ocean. Or you can go to speakupforblue.com. You can go to the Contact Us page, leave an email, or just fill out that contact. It goes right to my email. Or you can leave me a voicemail in the bottom right corner. There's a little microphone. Leave me a voicemail. Love to play it online to answer that question that you might have, or even the comment that you might have. But until next time, thank you so much for joining us on this episode of the How to Protect the Ocean podcast. I appreciate you listening. I am your host, Andrew Lewin. Have a great day. We'll talk to you next time, and happy conservation.